Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Begley Van Cleve Convocation, sponsored by the Political Science Department at Berea College and made possible by a gift from Roy R. Ray in memory of his sisters Edna Ray Begley and Faye Ray Van Cleve. I am Lauren McKee, and I will serve as the moderator for the question and answer portion of tonight's convocation. Our speaker tonight, Norman Ornstein, will be introduced by one of our Berea students, Natalie McAninch. Natalie is a senior political science major and faculty assistant from Liberty, Kentucky. She is currently working on a capstone project exploring the potential for political campaign public financing to be used as a mechanism for increasing voter and candidate participation. I will now turn it over to Natalie, and I will see you again when it's time for Q&A.
Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Begley Van Cleve Convocation. My name is Natalie McAninch, and I am a senior political science major with a minor in law, ethics, and society. Before beginning his career as a scholar of political science, this evening's speaker, Mr. Norman Ornstein, attended the University of Minnesota and then went on to obtain his master's and PhD in political science at the University of Michigan. Mr. Ornstein has been involved in political reform for decades, with a focus on campaign finance reform and the reform of Senate committees. Mr. Ornstein is currently a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies politics, elections, and the United States Congress. He is also a co-host of American Enterprise Institute's Election Watch series, a contributing editor and columnist for both the National Journal and The Atlantic, a BBC News election analyst, and the chairman of the Campaign Legal Center. Mr. Ornstein has made numerous television appearances on channels including MSNBC, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, and Comedy Central's 1992 Vote or Die segment. His articles and opinion pieces have also been published by Politico, The New York Times, New York Daily News, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. Mr. Ornstein is also the author of numerous best-selling books, including One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported, as well as the book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. After the speaker's final remarks, the audience is invited to submit their questions using the Q&A function. Now, I am honored to welcome to Berea College our speaker, Mr. Norman Ornstein.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm just sorry I can't be there with you in person to spend a little time on your beautiful campus. I want to start with just a cautionary note in the form of a story. It's a story that takes place on May the 5th, 1955, which is one of those days that comes along about every 11 years or so, 5/5/55. And it's a story about an accountant who couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning in his apartment in New York City. He finally got up in the wee hours of the morning and said, this just is crazy, it's not worth it. I'm just going to go into my office and finish an audit I'm working on. And he looked across the street where there was a bank. In those days, they used to have neon signs that flashed the time and temperature. And it was 5:55 in the morning and 55 degrees. So he goes down after getting dressed and gets to his office, which is on the 5th floor of a building at 5th Avenue and 55th Streets. And he goes up to his office, suite 555, and works on the audit. And about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he finishes it. And sure enough, both sides of the ledger, $5,555.55. And he takes his pencil, breaks it, throws it against the wall, and races down to the bank just before it closes and withdraws his life savings. Also $5,555.55. And he jumps in a cab and says, take me to the race course, Aqueduct, which was out on Long Island, quite a distance from Manhattan, but this was 1955, so the cab fare was only $5.55. And it was a balmy day, of course, 55 degrees. and the stands were packed, and so was the infield. And he worked his way through the crowd to a window and takes out all of his money and puts it down and says, "I want all of this on number 5 in the 5th race," just before they started. And he worked his way through to the crowd and until he could see them as they came around the bend and headed towards the finish line breathlessly. And of course, the horse finished 5th. Now, I mention that because here we are barely a week plus from the election, and we have all kinds of polls and all kinds of projections, and beware of making linear projections. We don't know where we will come out. Now, having said that, the title of the lecture talks about the age of tribalism and the pandemic. And obviously, right now, we're facing an enormous challenge in the country and in the society. I talk on a pretty regular basis with some of the nation's top infectious disease specialists. What's become clear is that in part because of the flu season, in part because in so many states, they have ignored any of the efforts to require masks, social distancing, or any kind of isolation. We're seeing the pandemic flare, and it may well hit its peak right around the time of the election. And then it's going to get worse as time passes. That may have an impact on the election itself, including on election day, including with poll workers who tend to be older to begin with, not showing up out of fear or because they themselves have the virus. The same with election officials and very possibly voters. So we have plenty of turmoil ahead, even along with all the rest that we face. More broadly, it's hard to ignore the reality of the distemper in the country and the challenges that we face in governance and in coming together and healing as a society. I want to start by talking about some of those challenges, by emphasizing as well that these are not simply challenges that are there because Donald Trump is president. Most of them preceded Donald Trump. Many of them helped to create the conditions that could allow an outsider like Trump win a nomination and then win the presidency. And many of them will be there after Trump leaves office, whenever that may be. And those are challenges for governance, even in a political system that happen to be working on all cylinders. And ours most certainly is not. The first one that I'll mention is economic inequality. Now, that's something that's in every society. There are always going to be haves and have-nots. But what's happened in the United States is that inequality has grown sharper and starker over the last 2 decades to a point where now we are near the top of societies in terms of the gap between the rich and the not rich. And what we know is that, and that's true in income as well as in wealth. What we know is that, especially over the last decade, the wealth of not just the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1% has grown astronomically. They've done well, including through the financial crisis in 2008 that spawned the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movement. They've done even better through the pandemic. They did better because tax cuts gave them even greater opportunities and breaks. Now, at one level, incomes have grown some, not a great deal, for workers in the middle class and the working class. But we know a couple of things. The first is there is a widespread sense that people have that they're working harder and harder just to keep up with where they have been. So many families have 2 earners in the family, often working 2 jobs. And it's like being gerbils on a treadmill, going faster and faster, but not getting any further from where you've been. At the same time, we're a country where people don't save a lot of money. And savings for most of us have been invested in our homes. That's the nest egg. And of course, the financial collapse shattered that nest egg for huge numbers of Americans, some of whom lost their homes, others saw them decline very sharply in value. And that has been a terrible blow to people. And even though the housing situation has gradually gotten better for an awful lot of people, they've gone through more than a decade of immense turmoil and all the plans that many people have had. The idea, if you're, as you get older, that you could ultimately at some point sell your home and use that nest egg, downsizing, moving into some other place for your retirement, for a down payment for your kids to have a house, for college tuition, or for medical costs, or almost anything else. And that's been a blow to people. And that, of course, generated this enormous populism on the left with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which didn't endure for very long as a movement, and the Tea Party movement on the right, which did, and which actually organized and had more political clout. And it was that populism on the right that helped Donald Trump win a nomination and get elected. Now, one of the things about populism, and we saw a wave of it back in the early 1990s, the late 1980s, was on the left with Ralph Nader, and the center with Ross Perot, on the right with Pat Buchanan, also at a time of some economic unease, is that it usually arises when you have unease and economic upheaval, but then it tends to recede when the economy gets better. One of the things that's been striking about the populism of this era is that from, say, 2011, 2012, 2013 on, as the economy was improving pretty sharply and doing better, and all the way through until the period right before COVID, with strong economy, that populism didn't go away. In fact, in some ways it got stronger. And populism brings with it almost always a few elements. One, of course, is a deep distrust of elites and a sense of disdain for expertise. A second is nativism, a feeling that immigrants coming in are challenging our jobs and changing our way of life. Of protectionism, to try and avoid foreign competition and invaders, and often some level of isolationism. And we've seen most of those elements emerge and in some ways get stronger as well. So that's one element, and I can come back to it in different ways a little bit further along. The second element, and it's certainly related, is the growing regional divide along multiple lines, including especially the economic one, but also the educational one, among others. And the reality is that while we have red states and blue states, firmly red, firmly blue, as well as others that are more competitive, within the red states and the blue states and the purple states, we have seen sharper divisions between the thriving major metropolitan areas, including cities and the suburbs that immediately surround them. And as you move further out towards the outer rings of suburbs from those major metropolitan areas to further away, what we call the exurbs, as you move from big cities towards smaller communities, 50,000 or so in population, down to very small towns and to rural areas, we see very sharp differences politically. But what we also see is the economic dynamism in the country, the economic growth in the country is centered in that smaller number of major metropolitan areas that contribute about 2/3 to our GDP and our growth. And the reason is that in those areas, you have all of the infrastructure that you would need to thrive and grow in the competition of a global economy and with all of the technological change taking place. In those areas, you have the educational infrastructure, the universities, the small startup companies in tech and health and elsewhere that are able to do well and innovate. You have a highly educated population that is able to get jobs and, if need be, to switch jobs, to get retrained, to be able to operate. You have a transportation infrastructure so that people can get to work. Hello, everybody. Sorry about that. This is what happens with modern technology, even in a major metropolitan area. Anyhow, I'm not sure where I got lost, but I was talking about the economic challenges as you move out to smaller communities, and the jobs that existed, some of which are under challenge, are going to decline, and there isn't necessarily a place or a way to replace them, with a population that doesn't have the education or necessarily the economic, educational, transportation, or technology infrastructure to be able to adapt very well. And of course, one of the reasons that Donald Trump succeeded, one of the main reasons, is that populations in those exurban, small town, rural areas that in many instances feel deep frustration, and a frustration that they have been basically left behind and are viewed with contempt by those elites, that Donald Trump spoke to them, directly to them, and said, I'm with you, not with them. Talked about draining the swamp, which was all of those elites in Washington doing just fine for themselves, while ignoring or having contempt for the rest of us. That resonated, and as we headed to the election in 2016, where it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win handily, and I can tell you, having been at BBC the night of the election, where we had a regular succession of Trump people. I'm sorry, everybody. I think it must be the Russians. So if this happens again, I will just call in. I tried to do it with my iPad instead of my computer, where I don't have to worry about Wi-Fi, but that didn't work either. So I'm going to, I don't want to keep you for all that long after our designated time is up, but I'm going to follow on. I was talking about the economic difficulties and the regional divide that we have that helped lead to a Donald Trump. And I want to add two other elements. One is the tribalism. And we know we have polarization, that we've had a process over probably a 50-year period where our parties sorted out regionally. We moved from a very different dynamic where the Democrats dominated the South because they had conservative lawmakers and won all of the electoral votes for decades, and that began to change in the 1960s. The West Coast had been a bastion of moderate Republicans, so was the Northeast and New England. Those became more Democratic, and the parties became more ideologically coherent and not heterogeneous. Became more like parliamentary parties. But you can still solve problems if you're polarized, if you both are focused on problems, share a sense of what the problems are, and are determined to work together, as Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch did for a very long time. But now what we have is a tribalized political system, not just in Washington, in states, and in the populace as a whole, where you don't view people on the other side of the aisle as just simply misguided, although they're very good people and worthy and they're all out to make America a better place. They just have lousy ideas. To they are the enemy and they're trying to destroy our way of life. Now, I would basically set that as having really gotten accelerated when Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House and was trying to find a way to achieve a Republican majority in Congress and in the country. But it was amplified by the rise right around the time that he emerged in Congress in the late 1970s and early 1980s by the emergence of tribal media, talk radio, and then cable television. And of course, now we have the social media that's amplified it as well. And we know going into the election that far more people are motivated by what political scientists call negative partisanship, trying to keep the evil people trying to destroy our way of life from winning anything, and not by that firm attachment to their own. And, you know, bluntly, one of the reasons that large numbers of people don't pay much attention to Donald Trump's ethical failings or statements that he makes are because if you criticize him or take him on, you're giving aid and comfort to the enemy. And that's just a fact of life in our modern day politics. It makes it much, much harder to get things done. If you're simply polarized, you work together, and when you solve a problem, as Kennedy and Hatch did with children's health insurance, for example, everybody applauds. But when you're tribalized, if you work with somebody on the other side, even if it's a worthy goal, you're sleeping with the enemy. And that's not going away anytime soon. In fact, because the business models of networks like Fox and MSNBC, of so many of the other media that we have, of the models of social media, thrive in a polarized environment and thrive more in a tribalized environment. We're likely to see it continue for a significant period of time. And of course, increasingly people get their information and their facts by cocooning into things that reinforce what they believe, which also makes governing much harder, because if you don't even share a common set of facts, climate change is one good example of that. You can't even begin to talk about ways through debate and deliberation on how to solve problems. Now, the last challenge that I'll mention, which has also been growing for some time and will be there for a long time to come, is some of the distortions that we have in the structure of our political system. Of course, you all know that the Constitution was set up with a compromise, a set of compromises, a lot of things designed to make sure that states, not just the Southern slaveholding ones, but all of the states, would go along with and ratify a constitution. And so they bent over backwards to give more of a role for the states in the Senate, which has a guarantee that every state will have equal representation of 2 senators, with the Electoral College and in many other ways, of course, including the 3/5 compromise. But that was at a time when the ratio of population between the smallest and largest states was about 12-1. Now it is 70-1. And that means that in a presidential election, the voters in Wyoming have 70 times the clout of the voters in California, the smallest in population, the largest in population. And what we know is that this process is going to get more challenging. People are moving to the states where they have those major metropolitan areas and the infrastructure and the jobs exist, and away from the smaller and more rural states where the economies have been stagnating. And what we know is that by 2040, 20 years from now, 70% of Americans will live in only 15 of our 50 states. 50% will live in only 8 of those states. What does that mean for the Electoral College? In a nutshell, if you look at the 44 presidential elections between 1824, when we really first counted popular votes, all the way up through 1996, arguably only one of those elections was it clear that the winner of the popular vote lost the presidency. 2 out of the last 5. And we could have an election this time, very possibly, where Donald Trump loses the popular vote by 6 million or more. He lost by 3 million the last time, and still could win an Electoral College majority. Now, if that doesn't happen, we're still likely to have more of those in the future because of the nature of the Electoral College and the distortions that come when the population shift that way. And increasingly, that will mean the sense by many voters that the system isn't working. You're supposed to be able to vote and the majority chooses. And simply saying, well, those are the rules, is not going to take away from this sense that many will feel of illegitimacy in the system. More significant, perhaps, is that by 2040, 30% of Americans will elect 70 of the 100 senators. Now, these are not all red states. Some of them, like Delaware or Maine, are blue. Others are more competitive. But the fact is that those 30% of the population do not represent, more broadly, the diversity in the country or the economic dynamism. And again, if people increasingly believe that their votes don't count, that when they believe something and they vote for it and the country chooses it, that it doesn't come out that way, there'll be a sense of illegitimacy. We've already seen that arise in many cases where voters want something to the tune of 70, 80, or 90%, 90% of Americans, for example, want universal background checks on guns, healthcare, universal coverage, infrastructure, and they don't happen. This sense that we don't have a closeness to the people in our election system, and it's true in the House as well, where we get increasing distortions because of partisan gerrymandering, as well as the fact that people's natural habitats concentrating votes in urban areas also mean that increasingly we find that a majority of Americans choose a minority of their own representatives. That's just not a healthy phenomenon. Now, if you put all of this together, it's a toxic mix and it's a real challenge. Now, where are we and where are we headed? Well, if we look at this election, just looking ahead and where we might be, we know that there are some similarities to 2016. Obviously, we know that Hillary Clinton had significant leads in the polls leading up to the election. As I mentioned before, there was a consensus that she was going to win. Even after we saw those late developments, including the role of the Russians in pushing votes to Jill Stein, including the letters by Jim Comey. But even with that, there was an expectation that she would win. And you can look at polls now and say, well, it could happen again. And of course it could. But there are some differences. In 2016, of course, Donald Trump ran as an outsider. And today he is running as an incumbent. In 2016, Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee in an open contest, was not well liked by a large share of Americans. And the election was framed, as it is when there's an open contest, as a choice. It was a choice that for a large numbers of people was the lesser of two evils. And Hillary Clinton came out on the short end of that stick, even for people who had misgivings about Donald Trump. But also when you have an election that people see as having two candidates that they don't find palatable, that creates more opportunities for third parties. And so Jill Stein at the Green Party, Gary Johnson at the Libertarian Party captured sizable numbers of votes, 3% or so each. And of course, Jill Stein won more votes in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan than was the margin of Donald Trump's victory. All of those things mattered. And we also knew that we didn't have late polls in some of these states that proved to be the battleground states. This time around, Trump is running as an incumbent, and he's running at a time when Americans, even if they approve by a small margin of his handling of the economy, a belief that the virus and the pandemic were not his fault when they came in, and that the economy was doing well before that, but they blame him for the handling of the pandemic. And there's enough economic unhappiness and enough unhappiness at the turmoil we faced throughout this last 4 years that he is not doing that well in approval. He hasn't gone up. In fact, this is the only presidency we've ever seen where the president never got above 50% in approval. In fact, rarely got above 40 or 41%. And Joe Biden is simply not disliked by people. The margin that Biden has at this point my colleague Carlin Bowman at AEI looked at 177 national surveys since the campaign began with the two candidates, and 133 of them, and that means good surveys generally that are national ones, Biden has been above 50%, which is generally the mark at which you look at a victory. And he seems to be doing well in battleground states, expanding the number of those states. And of course, at the same time, when we look at categories of voters that Trump did well with, older voters last time, college-educated suburban white voters, especially doing comparatively well with white women, and non-college educated white voters, that his numbers, when we look at surveys at congressional district or local levels that are able to get into more depth there in key places, he is doing much more poorly than he did in 2016. So it's not surprising that the major forecasting models, including 538.com, show a comfortable Biden electoral vote victory and suggest that his chances at this point are 88%. Clinton's were around that level as well last time. So you can't take it for granted, and that still leaves 12% as a chance for Trump. But it's not looking good for him, and his attitude, I think, reflects that right now, and we'll see if he continues to have a kind of foul mood, as he did in the interview he just did with Leslie Stahl, as he did in the first debate, with the debate that lies ahead. At the same time, Democrats look to be in a position which is quite unusual after a huge victory in the House in 2018 of picking up more seats there and very possibly picking up enough seats in the Senate to give themselves a majority and maybe even a larger majority than 50-50 or 51-49. If that happens, and if Democrats control all the reins of power, we are obviously going to see a very different set of policies moving forward. But all the conditions that I mentioned for gridlock, for distemper, for division in the country will remain, even with a president who has made it his top goal to try and heal those wounds, knit them, and unite the country again. The divisions are not going away. The ability to act will not go away without changes in the Senate rules, or we will see filibusters of almost everything in the same way we saw them when Barack Obama and his Democrats won even more sweeping victories in 2008. And that's what we saw in 2009 and 2010, and again after he won re-election. And that will make the challenge very much greater. Now, we also know, and I'm not going to go into great detail here because of the time that we lost with my internet failures, into some of the challenges we have if Trump loses but won't concede, with some of the turmoil that remains with counting the unprecedented number of early votes and votes by mail, the challenges in the post office, the fact that far more Democrats and independents are voting early and by mail, probably by a 3-to-1 margin compared to voting on election day. And by a 3-to-1 margin, Republicans are expecting to vote on election day. So the results we get on election eve will be very likely very different than the ones we will get in the days or even weeks that will follow. Many challenges ahead. And of course, I can't stop without mentioning that we are about to have something else that's unprecedented, which is a vote on a Supreme Court nominee a week before the election that will likely result in a sweeping change from the party in power, and an election for a Supreme Court justice that will dramatically change the character and outlook and policy perspective of the Supreme Court, and including a court that may decide to intervene in the election. So look for many challenges ahead, and we're going to have a lot of work to do to heal the wounds and to try and deal with some of these disparities that will increasingly bring into question the fundamentals of the system and the legitimacy that large numbers of Americans feel and whether their voices are being heard. The same sense of frustration and illegitimacy that the have-nots have felt that helped get Donald Trump elected, but that may move to a very different group of people as the next few years pass. Let me stop there. Fervently hope that you don't lose me again, and let's move to questions.
Thank you, Norman. Wow, you offered some really startling statistics, some demographic statistics that are going to have some very significant effects on the Electoral College.
Yes.
I want to encourage everyone to put their questions into the Q&A function. Go ahead and type those in. I know everyone types at different speeds, and so we'll be waiting for those to come in. While we're waiting to see your questions, I was going to ask Norm if you could speak a little bit to something that we've been thinking about. You mentioned institutions and the strength of American institutions. And one of the things that we've been thinking about and talking about a lot in my classes is to what extent of the last 4 years perhaps damaged the legitimacy of American institutions. And can we come back from that? And if so, how do we come back from that?
I'm very troubled. And I'm troubled first because you know, I've been around through eras where we had at least some people who could kind of transcend the divide, who were seen as above the fray, but also having just a great deal of credibility and legitimacy. I was very close to Paul Volcker, the now late legendary chairman of the Federal Reserve. I served with him on a commission that he chaired on the public service. One of the other people on that commission was Father Hesburgh, the longtime president of Notre Dame, a giant of a figure in American society. We just don't have them anymore. And where we do have figures like that, you could say a Bill Gates would fit that, a Warren Buffett might fit it. But whenever they express views in controversial areas, the tribal media on the other side attack them as being biased. We don't have the same respect for scientists. Look what's happened to Anthony Fauci now, the fact that he has to have bodyguards around him. If you don't believe in science or respect the specialists who have credibility, we can see what the consequences are. And all of that brings it down to the fact that the only institution that has a widespread respect in the country is the military. And even there, a series of scandals and problems have undermined its legitimacy. The courts used to have great credibility. That's lessened now. We know what's happened to the police. We have a great divide there. You know, one of the things that happens when you have cell phone cameras and body cameras is that you uncover horrible behavior that was never looked at before, even though it existed and took place. And that's created this enormous challenge as well. And then we have leaders who have exploited the seams in the system and broken up norms in ways that are deeply troubling. I am not one of the favored people by your own Mitch McConnell. In fact, I am pretty high on his enemies list, starting with my work on campaign finance reform, which of course is utter anathema to him, but also because I've harshly criticized him for what I see as having more to do with blowing up the norms of behavior in the Senate than anybody else. And what you realize when you study politics, as you know, Lauren, is that you can have laws, you can have a constitution, you can have rules, but it's the norms that are the kind of cartilage that keep the whole skeletal system together. And if the norms are violated, even if they are within the narrow letter of the law and the rules, over time, you run into a phenomenon. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the late senator, another mentor of mine, called it defining deviancy down, that it becomes the new normal and it's a lower normal. And I'm afraid that's where we are now. And the fact that the Senate today, the Judiciary Committee, violated its own rules to get a vote on Amy Coney Barrett coming out of the committee to move to the floor, and is violating its own rules to bring it up in an expedited fashion to the floor, just tells you how far we've come in a bad direction. And we find that true in the executive branch with many parts of the Trump presidency. We find it as you begin to see the inability to act in Congress with an expansion of executive power that is pushing the envelope. That's a very dangerous phenomenon, no matter who the president may be. And we find it with every other institution in the society. And you can't operate indefinitely when people don't trust their leadership, whatever whether it's elected leaders or others in institutions that matter. And if you have a deep division in the society over who has credibility. And that's a challenge we face, and we're going to have to find a way to overcome it if we're going to have another 200 years or even another 10 years or 20 years with the constitutional system we've had for well over 200.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. I'm just going to start with the first.
Yeah.
This comes from an attendee. It says, do you think the various court cases happening around the country challenging voting rules will affect enough votes or voters to sway the election?
And my answer to that is, I hope not and probably not. One of the things that happens when you get pretty blatant and overt efforts to suppress votes is that you get a counter reaction. You get people, especially if it's an election where they see the stakes as being very high, saying, to hell with you, I'm going to go through hell and high water to be able to vote. I'll give you an example of that. The governor of Texas issued what I would view as an outrageous executive order saying that there could be no more than one drop box, a place where people could submit their votes in any county in Texas. Harris County, Texas, is larger than Rhode Island, and it has a population of 1.5 million people or more. And that meant that people would have to travel 100 miles in some instances to be able to drop off their ballots if they didn't trust the Postal Service, instead of having the multiple places that would otherwise be there and that have been there in other elections to make it easy for people to vote. The Texas Supreme Court said, fine, that's okay, he can do that. And what we've seen is an enormous level of voting in Harris County early, because people are finding ways to go those great distances to vote because they don't want to take it anymore. Having said that, though, the trend that we have in the courts, a decision yesterday in the Supreme Court, that in Alabama, where you have a sizable number of elderly people with disabilities who wanted to be able to drop off their ballots instead of getting out of their cars, where they were in wheelchairs or where they feared the virus, which has worked before. And you have the Supreme Court saying, no, the state can block that from happening, which poses just a terrible burden on people. The general outlook of the courts, which is the protection against voter fraud, where we have no evidence of it, is more significant than blocking or delegitimizing the actual votes of legitimate voters in the thousands or tens of thousands or more, is a very troubling thing. Right now, I don't think it will affect huge numbers of votes. It will affect some, but it's not the way our system is supposed to work. And frankly, one of the things that I'd proposed some years ago, we don't have a constitutional right for everybody to vote. We have rights to vote in the 13th and 14th Amendments. Sadly, the strict constructionists and textualists and originalists don't pay much attention to the 13th and 14th Amendments. But I'd love to see a constitutional amendment that just simply gives the right of all eligible American citizens to vote. And then the courts would have a much harder time overcoming that hurdle. And maybe at some point we'll get that. Most Americans don't know that they don't have a constitutional right to vote.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. Do you see the tide of populism continuing to wax in America? And if so, what are some of the measures we can support to enhance the traditions of a liberal democracy?
So first, a couple of broader comments. One is the tide of populism is all around the world. So many of the phenomena we're facing, and that includes just upheaval in the economies, the climate change that's creating upheaval in lots of places, the immigration that's coming, some from refugees because of all of the turmoil. We're seeing it everywhere. We see left-wing populism in Venezuela, but in a whole lot of places in Eastern and Central Europe, and moving in Western Europe, we're seeing the rise of anti-immigration, right-wing populist parties and attraction that's being gained there. So it's not unique to us. I don't see it going away anytime soon, because we're going to have all of this unease that we feel. Populism is not all bad. It's kind of built into the DNA of America. The idea that we don't put full trust in our leaders, that they have feet of clay, that's not a bad thing. You don't want to have a government where you can have an autocracy that develops because you'll let them do what they want. But at the same time, it's got all of these pernicious things. And I think what we have to do is, one, tackle economic inequality. Two, reach out to and have empathy for people who are in communities where they're struggling. And of course, what we know is if you lose the infrastructure of jobs in a community, then all of the other elements that stitch a community together, marriage, family, um, begin to have enormous strains. You get drug use, you get alcoholism, the opioid epidemic, all of the things that we know are there in Hillbilly Elegy and other places that we saw in African-American communities in cities like Chicago, which had thriving infrastructure when jobs were there. And when the jobs moved out of the city, then we got those other pathologies that develop. It has not to do with culture or race as much as it does. You've got to have an economic infrastructure that works for people. And we've got to find ways to make sure that jobs are there and that all of the support services are there for people. We've got to make sure that there's a healthcare system that works for people through a pandemic and that we provide support for people when the economy falters because of the pandemic. If we can do some of those things, if we can show that government's responsive where people need it, then maybe we'll rebuild some trust and maybe we'll also get some willingness to listen to what experts have to say and what scientists say.
Well, let me unmute myself, right? That's the phrase for 2020. Let me unmute myself. We have a couple more questions. One says, it would seem based on your words tonight that much of this tribalism exists within the conservative side of American politics. So why do you think that Democrats haven't started playing dirty, and should they? And I think Mr. Ornstein is frozen. I don't think that, that's the question that stumped him. I think he's frozen. So we'll just wait and pause a minute for him to come back to us.
You know, it's weird. This has not happened to me before tonight, including with your students and with the class that we had today. So
well,
I
you're
apologize.
Fortunate because
yeah.
like that happens to me all the time.
Yeah, I missed your last question.
Sure, I can read it again.
Yeah.
It would seem based on your words tonight that much of this tribalism exists within the conservative side of American politics. So why do you think that Democrats haven't started playing dirty, and should they?
So the tribalism is there on both sides, but it really arose more on the conservative side. And remember, the first sort of tribal media were really the talk radio elements that developed in the late 1980s. Rush Limbaugh, when Rush Limbaugh had been a Sacramento, California noontime talk show host when the Federal Communications Commission ended the fairness doctrine, which meant that you could have highly opinionated radio, moved to New York and became a national figure. And then we saw all these other talk radio stations develop far more on the right than on the left. And left-wing talk radio has really not done particularly well. Fox News became a huge thing. And now we have others like OAN and RT. And MSNBC, which has done well in the Trump era, but may find itself struggling a little bit more when Trump goes. And I think part of the reason for that is that conservatives have long felt that they're in the minority in the country, in the minority in the educational world, in the minority in the media world. And even though now they have this enormously successful range of media outlets, there's still that sense of being victims in this process. I think we're going to see that happen more. We've already seen it happen a little bit more on the left. But I also think that there's a difference in the parties. The Democratic Party is more a coalition of groups. Now it's more a coalition of minority groups, but it's a coalition of groups. And figuring out how you can keep that coalition together takes a little bit away from having a cohesive viewpoint of looking at the other side in a negative way, but acting on it. The Republican Party has been more a party of ideology, I think now almost a party of theology, and that has made it look more at outcomes and finding ways to achieve those outcomes than process. Democrats have tended to be a little bit more attuned to institutions, but I'm not going to say that the Democratic Party or the left are angels. Nobody is in this process. People do what they need to do in a political process to make it work, and it becomes in part the question of whether you have enough to be able to make those things happen. And the challenge for the Democrats, if they have all the reins of power, and if Mitch McConnell does lead his Senate Republicans to filibuster everything that Trump or that Biden wants to do on healthcare, on guns, on democracy reforms, on infrastructure and economic recovery, on national actions on COVID, then they're going to face the question of whether they move further to change the filibuster for legislation. And of course, having seen what's happened with the courts, use of the filibuster and misuse of what's called the blue slip to keep slots open after, while Obama was president, that he had every right to fill, and then to fill them rapidly with Trump's appointees. So appeals courts, district courts, as well as the Supreme Court, then we have the challenge of what you do to overcome that. And we know now that today, Joe Biden has called for the creation of a commission, a bipartisan commission to look at the courts. And some of that is kind of a signal to the Supreme Court. If you really want to use your 6-vote majority, which is pretty much a really bedrock conservative majority, to hamstring the executive and the Congress, much less to overturn Roe, probably not in one vote, but by multiple decisions, or to undercut the healthcare reform. If you do that, the consequence is going to be that you're going to lose your majority. And maybe we'll see John Roberts and others a little more pragmatic, going a little slower on that front. But Democrats, I think, are getting close to the point where they're going to start to use some of those tactics. It's a shame that we're at that point, or that we have to even think about things along those lines.
Thank you. We have one more question, and I
Yes.
want to squeeze the last question in. And it says, what do you see of the future of the Republican campaign strategy after a Trump loss? Do you think they will adopt the anti-establishment rhetoric of the Trump campaign from 2016, or is it more likely we see a return to the older establishment GOP tricks?
So let me say, I've been in Washington for about 50 years. And even though I look much younger, I know. I've spent decades working with Republicans and Democrats. The list of Republicans at top levels who I work closely with would take me an hour to go through. But it's a party that's changed. And I think, if you look at, remember after the 2012 election, Republicans thought they were going to defeat Barack Obama, and it stunned them that they didn't. And Reince Priebus, who was then the chair of the party, did this famous autopsy that concluded that Republicans were on the wrong end of the demographic reality in America. And if they wanted to compete for a majority, they would have to change. And the main recommendation at that point, because we were moving, of course, towards becoming a country where minority populations within a couple of decades are going to be a majority of the country, was an immigration reform proposal. And that same Reince Priebus became chief of staff to Donald Trump and threw that autopsy in the garbage can. The party made a choice, and Donald Trump pushed it to make the choice not to try to expand where it was going, but to double down on a base of about 40% of the country and then use voter suppression tactics and scare tactics to keep down the votes from Democrats and independents and to hype up the votes from their own partisans. If that fails this time, it's the second election in a row. And we know that Generation Z and Generation Y are increasingly becoming Democrats in the way they behave. They voted that way in 2018. They'll vote that way in 2020. If people just coming of age in the electorate vote the same way 3 times in a row, what our research shows is that's the identity that they develop. And the challenge for Republicans after Trump is going to be, are you going to try to compete for a larger share of the electorate by changing some of your policies? Keep them conservative, but appeal with a different rhetoric and with some sensitivity to the needs of those different populations. Or are you going to continue to do the same thing? And I would say the key to this is if they keep doing what they've been doing, and then in 2022, the midterm, they win the same kind of election comeback that they got in 2010 and 2014, they aren't going to change. And then the people who will compete for a Republican presidential nomination will be either Trump's progeny, Donald Jr. or Ivanka running as the next Trump, or the Tom Cottons or Josh Hawleys, who will basically say, I'm just like Trump, but I'm smarter. Or will there be any opportunity for somebody who would run as a more traditional conservative, one of the never Trumper type people, or even for somebody like Governor Charlie Baker of Massachusetts or Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, Republicans who've had enormous success in very blue states, running as pragmatic, moderate conservatives, to be able to win a Republican nomination where then they could compete more broadly. I think at this point, there isn't much hope for the latter, but it will take a big defeat in the next midterm to jolt the party into realizing that they better change their ways or they will not win very many national elections in the future. And we need 2 parties that are problem-solving, focused, and the Republican Party is going to be a conservative party. It's not going to be a left-wing party or a center party. It can be a center-right party, but it has to be able to look at winning a majority in the electorate, appealing to a majority, and looking to solving problems from healthcare to climate change to our international alliances. And a lot of that's been lost, I believe, over the last 4 years, and we need it back. I don't want a one-party system, whichever party it is. And I don't want to see a system where one party dominates, because what happens when one party dominates is it gets corrupted, no matter which party it is.
Unmute.
Yeah.
You've given us so much to think about tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our attendees also for sticking with us through our technical difficulties. That's just the tenor of 2020, right? So I'll turn it over then to Tomas, who I think will wrap us up here at the end.
Hi, this is Thomas Ahrens, Director of Convocations. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us through the technical troubles. And so I just want to express my gratitude to our participants tonight. So our distinguished speaker, Norm Ornstein, thank you so much for all your insights. Political science professor Lauren McKee, my colleague, thank you. Berea College senior Natalie McAninch, thank you so much, Natalie. And finally, audiovisual engineer Kyle Wooten, who landed this plane. So looking ahead to our next convocation, please join us this Sunday, October the 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern for a Stevenson Memorial Concert about the women's suffrage movement. So be safe and good night, everyone. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.